but if you look at three different policy issues, you can get a sense of where the Chinese might go with this new leadership. The first is North Korea. Much in the news of late, and it would have been a much more difficult issue for us to deal with, I think, had it not been for the six-party talks and the agreed framework talks that had gone before. I was part of the original discussions with the North Koreans way back in 1988, where we held our first discussions with the North Koreans at the International Club in Beijing, and the Chinese facilitated those talks. They made a room available and then got the heck out of there and left us to talk to the North Koreans. We spoke in Chinese because the North Koreans spoke no English and we spoke no Korean at that time. What evolved over time on the Korean issue was not just Chinese facilitation, but Chinese participation in those talks, recognizing real interest as the North Koreans did one thing after another that hurt Chinese interests. They finally decided they needed to get involved in this and try to help steer the direction, such that now Japanese Koreans, South Koreans, North Koreans, Americans, and the Chinese are really engaged in give and take to try to make this work. Much different from the original position of the Chinese, which was essentially, we'll take care of our stuff, you take care of your stuff, and this is on the side of your stuff. One imagines that the Chinese will continue to use their influence in North Korea to moderate the outcome. I think they have more patience than most of us, although the South Koreans have learned the benefit of allowing North Korea to gradually improve its situation such that when reunification finally comes, and it will at some point because North Korea is a failing regime, it won't be quite so expensive, not so much per capita in South Korea, to absorb the North or to find a way to work some sort of federal confederation with the North. Whatever the outcome is, it will be less expensive over time to the South Koreans if the North Koreans can gradually change rather than simply collapse. And the Chinese look at it that way too and are patient about that, would be happy for the current situation to persist for a while. But I think they've made their decision about where this will end up, and they made that decision in 1992 when they recognized South Korea. So you see in the in the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese influence on North Korea, the Chinese exercising influence in a way that is consistent with American interests, that is conducive to stability in the global system, and is helpful, frankly, to those communities of nations that have an interest in Northeast Asia. I think, to take another example, Iran poses an issue where the Chinese could do more, but have done more than most people recognize, particularly as a member of the Permanent Five on the UN Security Council. The Chinese have not been an obstacle, and at times have pushed the Iranians at particularly difficult moments when the Iranians want to move in a more inimical direction. The Chinese have exercised influence. They could do a lot more, and their interests are engaged, so they should do a lot more. But they're careful, more careful on that issue, further from their borders than they have been with North Korea. And then finally, to touch on the South China Sea as an example of many of these issues we've just been talking about. I referred briefly to President Obama's trip in November, which was, I think, widely appreciated in Washington, inside the Beltway, as a forceful or muscular articulation of U.S. interests, and one that was called for and perhaps even overdue. I think in Asia, the trip was viewed with some trepidation. Most of the participants in Southeast Asia, at least, were wary of a quarrel between the United States and China and getting caught in the middle, which is something they prefer to avoid. I think in China, the trip fed those who actually do understand but prefer to use as a tool nationalism in the domestic scene, and fed this concern, popular concern that's really out there, that the United States is keeping China down. So it illustrates the difficulty, the fine line that has to be walked in aggressive as necessary and certainly muscular representation of strong American interests on the economic, political, and in many other arenas on the one hand, and the need to be aware of how we're influencing China and who we are or are not helping. We're not always as savvy about that as we might be.